The bank manager's voice dropped so low I almost thought the call had disconnected. "Lieutenant Colonel Donovan, your father is here with a woman claiming to be your mother." I remember laughing, not because it was funny, because sometimes the brain rejects reality before the heart can catch up. "That's impossible," I said. "My mother is in Europe." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for something cold to settle beneath my ribs. Then he said quietly, "Ma'am, the woman has your mother's identification. Her signature matches, and your father insists she is his wife." I stood in the middle of my kitchen holding the phone while the coffee maker hissed behind me like distant static. Outside my townhouse window, a garbage truck rolled slowly through the neighborhood. Somewhere across the street, a dog barked twice and stopped. Everything sounded painfully ordinary. And then the manager said the sentence that changed the shape of my family forever. "There's something else you should know," he whispered. "The woman looks exactly like your mother." For the first time in 20 years of military service, my hand started to shake. "My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 42 years old, an Army lieutenant colonel, and I spent most of my adult life believing that if you stayed calm long enough, the truth eventually revealed itself. That morning I learned something worse. Sometimes the truth arrives wearing your mother's face. The phone call came at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning while I was standing barefoot in my kitchen waiting for coffee. I remember the exact time because military life teaches you to notice details automatically. Timestamps, tone shifts, silence, the tiny fractures where reality begins to crack. I had just finished ironing my uniform pants for a Pentagon briefing later that afternoon. My townhouse in Alexandria still smelled faintly of starch and dark roast coffee. The television in the living room played a morning news segment nobody was really watching. I lived alone, so I often kept the television on for noise more than information. The bank manager introduced himself as Daniel Mercer from First National Trust. Professional voice, controlled breathing, the kind of man trained never to sound alarmed in front of clients. But alarm leaks anyway. It leaks into pauses, into lowered volume, into sentences that arrive too carefully. At first I thought maybe my father had fallen. Richard Donovan was 74 now, stubborn enough to pretend his knees still worked like they had in 1989. A retired police officer with a spine full of old injuries and opinions nobody could change. We weren't close, but we still existed in each other's orbit the way families do, even after years of emotional distance. Then the manager said my mother's name, and everything tilted. "She's attempting to authorize changes to a family trust account." My grip tightened around the coffee mug. "My mother is in Florence," I said slowly. "She left 12 days ago." "I understand," he replied. "That's why I'm calling." I don't remember deciding to sit down. One second I was standing at the kitchen counter, and the next I was at the table staring at the condensation sliding down the outside of my untouched coffee cup. The manager continued carefully. "Your father insists this woman is your mother, Margaret Donovan. But one of our associates felt something was inconsistent." "Inconsistent how?" Another pause. "Ma'am, she resembles your mother almost perfectly, but there are details that don't align." Details. That word stayed with me. Because details are where lies fail. I've spent enough years in military intelligence briefings to know that people prepare for facts. They rehearse dates, names, signatures. What they can't rehearse are instincts, muscle memory, the unconscious habits that belong to real lives. "When did they arrive?" I asked. "About 40 minutes ago." "And you're calling me instead of the police?" "Yes." "Why?" His answer came softly. "Because your father seems willing to proceed." That was the moment my stomach dropped. Not because I believed my father was being manipulated. Because for the first time I considered the possibility that he wasn't. I ended the call 10 minutes later and stood motionless in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind me. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor in pale rectangles. Somewhere upstairs my neighbor vacuumed her hallway rug with determined aggression. Normal life continued with offensive confidence while mine had quietly split open. I walked upstairs to change clothes. Not my uniform, civilian clothes. Dark jeans, gray sweater, hair pulled back tightly. Something neutral, something controlled. As I buttoned the sleeves, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. People often assume military officers enjoy authority. Some do. I never did. What I liked was structure, clarity, the relief of rules. Families don't have rules. Families have old wounds disguised as traditions. On the drive to the bank, traffic crawled along Route 50 beneath a washed-out Virginia sky. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel and replayed the manager's words over and over. "She looks exactly like your mother." My mother had been in Florence for nearly 2 weeks with 2 retired teachers from Maryland she'd met on a cruise years earlier. She sent photos every morning like clockwork: churches, sidewalk cafes, tiny cups of espresso she pretended to enjoy more than she actually did. My mother hated espresso. I almost called her 3 times during the drive. Each time I stopped myself. Military training teaches restraint before reaction. Gather information first, emotion later. By the time I pulled into the bank parking lot, my heartbeat had settled into something cold and deliberate. First National Trust sat between a dentist's office and a law firm in one of those polished suburban buildings, designed to look reassuringly expensive. Clean glass, beige stone, carefully trimmed hedges outside the entrance. I walked inside and immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. People looked away too quickly. A young teller near the front desk recognized me before I spoke. Relief crossed her face so fast it almost hurt to watch. "Lieutenant Colonel Donovan," she asked quietly. I nodded. "This way, please." She led me through a side hallway into a private office where Daniel Mercer stood waiting beside a glass wall partially covered by lowered blinds. He looked exactly how worried bankers look when they're trying desperately not to appear worried. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said. "Where are they?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the window. "I think you should prepare yourself." I stepped closer and looked through the narrow gap in the blinds. My father sat at a polished conference table wearing the same brown wool coat he'd owned since my first deployment to Afghanistan. His posture was rigid, impatient. One hand tapped against the table in short, irritated rhythms I recognized instantly from childhood. And beside him sat my mother. Except it wasn't. For one impossible second, my body believed it anyway. Same silver blonde hair. Same elegant posture. Same navy scarf tied carefully at the neck. The resemblance struck like physical force. But then I saw it. The wedding ring. Wrong hand. My mother had worn her ring on her left hand for 47 years. The woman in the bank wore hers on the right. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Someone had studied my mother closely. Very closely. I stayed behind the glass for several seconds longer than necessary, staring at the woman seated beside my father while my mind tried to force logic into something that no longer felt logical. The resemblance wasn't superficial. It wasn't the kind of similarity people politely point out at grocery stores or airports. This woman had my mother's posture, her careful stillness, even the slight tilt of her head when listening to someone speak. Someone had trained her. That realization disturbed me more than the impersonation itself. Because people don't rehearse another human being unless there's something valuable waiting on the other side. "She presented valid identification," Daniel Mercer said quietly beside me. "Driver's license. Passport copy, social security verification." "Fake." "We don't know yet." I kept my eyes on my father, and he insists she's my mother. "Yes?" The word landed heavily between us. I finally stepped away from the glass and crossed my arms tightly over my chest. The office suddenly felt too warm. Somewhere beyond the walls I heard the muffled ring of a desk phone and the soft mechanical sound of a printer feeding paper. Ordinary sounds? That was the strange thing about Betrayal. It happened while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and people refilled coffee cups and somebody somewhere worried about lunch plans. Disaster almost never announces itself dramatically. It arrives quietly and sits down at a conference table pretending to belong there. "What exactly are they trying to authorize?" I asked. Mercer opened a folder carefully as if even paper needed to be handled delicately now. "A restructuring of the Donovan family trust, several property transfers, authorization changes, access modifications. My mother would never authorize financial changes without speaking to me first." He looked uncomfortable. "Your father indicated the family preferred privacy." I almost smiled at that. Privacy. That was one way to describe my father's approach to family life. Silence was another. When I was 8 years old, I fell off my bike hard enough to split my chin open on concrete. I remember sitting in the emergency room with blood drying stiff against my shirt, while my father looked at me and said, "Crying doesn't solve anything, Claire." Not cruelly. That's what made it worse. He genuinely believed he was teaching strength. Years later, after Ranger School, after deployments, after commendations and leadership commands, I realized something painful about my father. He respected endurance. But he distrusted emotional intelligence because he mistook it for weakness. And daughters who survived without needing comfort made men like him uneasy. "Can I speak to him alone?" I asked. Mercer hesitated. "We'd prefer not to escalate the situation." "I'm not going to escalate it." That part at least was true. He escorted me through another hallway into a smaller office overlooking the parking lot. 5 minutes later the door opened and my father walked in. Richard Donovan still carried himself like a cop even in retirement. broad shoulders despite age, thick gray eyebrows permanently drawn downward as if disappointment had become his resting expression. He stopped when he saw me. For one brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt. Something closer to irritation. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "No, hello." No surprise. Just immediate defensiveness. I leaned back slightly in the chair. "Interesting thing to say to your daughter after a bank calls claiming you arrived with my mother's identical twin." His jaw tightened. "That woman is your mother." "No," I said calmly, "she isn't." Silence stretched between us. I watched his eyes carefully. My father had never been a good liar. He became too still when hiding something. As a child, I used to know he'd broken promises before he even spoke because his entire body would seem to brace itself against honesty. He looked exactly like that now. "You always assume the worst," he muttered. The sentence hit harder than it should have, because he'd been saying versions of it my entire life. When I questioned Ethan borrowing money repeatedly. When I warned my mother not to co-sign another loan. When I suggested my younger brother's business ideas sounded unstable. "You think too much," my father used to tell me. Maybe I did. But thinking too much was how you survived military command. And sometimes it was how you survived family. "I spoke to Mom yesterday," I said quietly. "She was in Florence. She came back early. She posted photos from Italy this morning." His eyes shifted away from mine for half a second. There it was. The fracture. I felt cold suddenly, not emotional, precise. "You gave someone her identification," I said. "That's enough. You copied her documents. Claire. You let a stranger sit in a bank pretending to be your wife." He slammed his palm against the desk hard enough to rattle a pen cup. I said enough. The outburst echoed briefly through the office before disappearing into silence again. I didn't flinch. That seemed to anger him more. My father studied me for several long seconds, and I recognized the expression with painful familiarity. It was the same look he wore after my promotion ceremony 3 years earlier, proud beneath the surface but overshadowed by something else. Distance. As though every accomplishment pushed me farther outside his understanding of womanhood. "You've changed," he said finally. I almost laughed. "No," I replied softly. "I just stopped asking permission to have opinions." That landed. I saw it in the slight movement of his mouth. For years, our conversations followed the same invisible rules. I stayed composed. He stayed emotionally unreachable. We both pretended restraint was the same thing as peace. But something had shifted now. Not loudly. Quietly. Like ice cracking under weight. His phone buzzed against the desk. He looked down immediately. Too quickly. I noticed the contact name before he turned the screen over. Ethan. Of course. A strange exhaustion moved through me then. Not because my brother might be involved, because some part of me had expected it instantly. Ethan Donovan was 38 years old and still lived like consequences were optional. Failed businesses, gambling debt, promises built from smoke. My father spent decades rescuing him while calling it support. Meanwhile, I became the daughter who never needed saving. That role sounds flattering until you realize what it really means. No one checks whether the strong child is lonely. No one asks if she's tired. My father stood abruptly. "We're leaving," he said. "You're not," I answered. He stared at me. I held his gaze steadily. For the first time in my life, I think he realized I wasn't trying to win his approval anymore. And that frightened him. After he left the office, I stayed seated for nearly a minute staring at the empty chair across from me. My heartbeat remained slow and controlled, but beneath it, something older had begun to ache. Not anger. Grief. The grief of recognizing a pattern you spent years trying not to name. My phone vibrated in my pocket. "Mom calling." I answered immediately. Her face appeared on the screen beneath bright Italian sunlight. She sat outside a cafe wearing oversized sunglasses and smiling warmly. "There's my soldier," she said. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Behind her, Florence moved peacefully through another afternoon, entirely unaware that someone across an ocean was borrowing her identity. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. I forced my voice steady. "Did Dad ask you for copies of your passport before your trip?" Her smile faded slightly. "Yes," she said slowly. "Why?" The cold feeling returned instantly. What did he say he needed them for? "The bank," she replied. "Something about updating records." I closed my eyes briefly. When I opened them again, I looked through the office window toward the conference room. The fake woman sat beside my father with terrifying confidence. And suddenly I understood this hadn't started today. This had been building quietly for months. Maybe longer. I didn't go home after leaving the bank. Instead, I drove aimlessly through Northern Virginia for nearly an hour with the radio off, and both hands fixed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like I was transporting explosives instead of thoughts. The sky hung low and gray over the highway. Traffic moved in restless waves around me while my mind kept circling the same unbearable question. How long had my father been planning this? Not because I believed he was some criminal mastermind. Richard Donovan wasn't subtle enough for that. He was a man who solved problems the same way he had as a police officer in the 80s, push harder, speak louder, refuse embarrassment at all costs. But desperation changes people. Especially older men terrified of losing control. At a red light near Arlington, I finally pulled into the parking lot of a diner I used to visit after late shifts years ago. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted faintly burned no matter what time of day you ordered it. Inside, the lunch crowd had already thinned. A waitress in her 60s refilled sugar dispensers near the counter while country music played softly overhead. I chose a booth near the back and ordered black coffee. The waitress looked at me carefully. "Long day already, honey." I almost told her yes. Instead, I nodded once and said something like that. She gave me the kind of understanding smile older women reserve for strangers carrying visible exhaustion. No questions. No performance. Just quiet recognition. When she walked away, I took out my notebook. Not my phone. Paper. Military habits die hard. Important thoughts belong somewhere batteries can't fail. I started writing names first. Richard Donovan. Ethan Donovan. Margaret Donovan. Unknown female impersonator. Then beneath that one sentence. Someone studied my mother closely enough to become her. I stared at the words for a long time. The waitress returned with coffee and slid the mug toward me carefully. "You look military," she said. "Army. My son was Marines." She smiled faintly. Different uniforms, same eyes. What eyes? The tired ones. After she walked away, I sat there listening to the sound of silverware clinking against plates, while an uncomfortable truth slowly settled into place. I wasn't shocked my father would help Ethan financially. He'd been doing that my entire life. What shocked me was this. He was willing to erase my mother to do it. That changed everything. By late afternoon, I drove to my parents' house in Fairfax. Colonial-style brick home. White shutters. Perfect lawn my father still insisted on mowing himself despite his knees. From the outside, it looked like the kind of house where people hosted Thanksgiving dinners and discussed weather forecasts over pie. The safest-looking homes often hide the quietest damage. I parked down the street instead of in the driveway. Old instinct. Observe first. The curtains were closed. My father's truck sat in the garage with the door partially open, no sign of Ethan's car. I walked up slowly, my boots crunching softly across the gravel edge near the driveway. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. Inside the garage, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That's where I saw the printer. Large industrial scanner beside it. Stacks of paper. And suddenly my chest tightened. Not because of what was there. Because of how organized it was. Folders labeled neatly in my father's handwriting. Bank. Legal. Trust. Margaret. I stepped closer carefully. The scanner glass still held a faint fingerprint smudge across one corner. Nearby sat copies of my mother's driver's license, passport pages, and insurance documents. High-quality reproductions. Recent. Precise. Someone had been building another version of my mother piece by piece. I opened another folder. Inside were pages filled with handwriting practice. My mother's signature repeated over and over. Some shaky. Some almost perfect. I sat down heavily on an old wooden stool beside the workbench. For several seconds I simply stared. Not angry yet. Just stunned by the intimacy of the betrayal. Forgery from strangers feels criminal. Forgery from family feels personal. My phone buzzed suddenly against my jeans pocket hard enough to make me flinch. Daniel Mercer. I answered immediately. "Lieutenant Colonel Donovan," he said quietly, "there's something else." What? We identified the woman. Every muscle in my body tightened. Her name is Deborah Collins, 58, former community theater actress. Actress. Of course. That explained the posture, the rehearsed gestures, the studied confidence. How did you identify her? One of our associates recognized her from local theater productions years ago. I looked back down at the forged signatures spread across the workbench. Does she know she's committing fraud? We're not certain. That answer mattered. Because intent changes everything. There was a long pause before Mercer continued. Your father scheduled another appointment Friday morning. He intends to finalize the trust modifications. What modifications exactly? Another hesitation. Then carefully the family home would transfer primarily to Ethan Donovan under revised medical assistance provisions. I closed my eyes slowly. There it was. The real center of it. Not greed exactly. Fear. My father had spent decades protecting Ethan from adulthood while quietly assuming I'd survive anything alone. Because I always had. I remembered being 16 and winning a statewide academic scholarship while Ethan got arrested for drunk driving the same week. At dinner that night, my father barely looked at my award letter. All his attention stayed fixed on Ethan. He's struggling, Mom had whispered to me later. As though achievement automatically canceled the need for tenderness. I opened my eyes again and stared at the papers spread across the garage workbench. For the first time all day, anger arrived cleanly. Not explosive. Cold. Measured. Military anger. The dangerous kind. When Friday comes, I said quietly into the phone, "Do not stop them from coming in." Mercer sounded surprised. "Ma'am?" "Let them believe the plan is working." Silence. Then understanding. "You want them comfortable?" "Yes." I ended the call and sat alone in the garage listening to rain begin tapping softly against the roof overhead. The smell of motor oil and old cardboard filled the air. Nearby, hanging from rusted hooks against the wall, were my father's old police uniforms, sealed carefully in dry-cleaning plastic. Beside them sat a dusty cardboard box labeled Claire. I frowned slightly and pulled it down. Inside were photographs. Commendation letters. Military articles clipped from newspapers. My Bronze Star citation. Things I hadn't known my father kept. I stared at them for a long moment. Then I noticed something strange. Every article had been folded inward. As though someone wanted to preserve them without ever fully looking at them. My throat tightened unexpectedly. For years I thought my father ignored my accomplishments because he didn't care. But sitting there in the dim garage light surrounded by forged signatures and hidden newspaper clippings, I realized something more painful. Maybe he cared. Maybe he just never knew what to do with a daughter who became stronger than he understood how to love. Rain hammered harder overhead. I closed the box carefully. Then I found the photograph. A printed headshot of the fake woman smiling stiffly at the camera. On the back in my father's handwriting were 2 words. Deborah Final Fitting. And suddenly the entire thing stopped feeling impulsive. This wasn't confusion. It was rehearsal. Friday morning arrived under a steady cold rain that turned the sidewalks silver and blurred the edges of buildings behind sheets of water. I woke before dawn without needing an alarm. For several minutes I lay still in bed listening to the sound of rain tapping softly against the townhouse windows, while the events of the past 3 days arranged themselves carefully in my mind. Military life teaches you something strange about fear. The anticipation is usually worse than the event itself. By the time confrontation arrives, the body has already accepted survival as a requirement. I got dressed slowly. Dark charcoal sweater. Black wool coat. Hair secured tightly at the base of my neck. No jewelry except my watch. I drank coffee standing at the kitchen counter without tasting it. Outside headlights moved silently through the wet morning streets, while somewhere nearby a siren wailed faintly in the distance before disappearing again. At 7:42 my phone vibrated. Mom. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Her face appeared tired this time. The warm excitement from Florence had faded. Behind her, the hotel room looked dim and partially packed. "Claire," she said softly, "your father isn't answering my calls." I leaned one hand against the counter. "When does your flight land tomorrow?" 3 in the afternoon. A pause. Then quietly, "What's happening?" I closed my eyes briefly. For the first time since Tuesday, I almost told her everything. But I pictured her alone in another country trying to board a plane while carrying the weight of betrayal across an ocean. Not yet. "I'm handling it," I said. Her expression changed slightly at those words. Not relief. Recognition. My mother knew that tone. It was the same voice I used before deployments, calm enough to frighten people who loved me. "Claire," she whispered carefully, "don't destroy yourself trying to hold everyone together." The sentence settled heavily in my chest. Because she understood something my father never had. Strength costs something. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said quietly. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the rain sliding down the glass. Then I picked up my keys and left. The bank lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and damp umbrellas when I arrived. Friday customers moved through the building with subdued impatience, shaking rainwater from coats and checking phones, while employees smiled professionally through another gray morning. Normal life. Again. Always normal life surrounding catastrophe. Daniel Mercer met me near the elevators without speaking. He simply nodded once and guided me toward the conference rooms and back. "They're early," he said quietly. "How early?" 20 minutes. That told me everything. People arrive early when they're nervous, or when they're eager for something they believe is finally within reach. The conference room looked exactly as I remembered. Long polished table, tall windows blurred with rain, soft overhead lighting designed to calm wealthy clients discussing uncomfortable numbers. But today the room felt colder, more fragile somehow. My father sat at the far end wearing his brown coat despite the warmth inside. Beside him sat Ethan. My younger brother looked exhausted. Unshaven, pale, hands moving constantly against each other beneath the table. And beside Ethan sat Deborah Collins, the fake version of my mother. Up close, the resemblance remained unsettling. She wore my mother's pearl earrings, her silver blonde hair curled carefully at the shoulders exactly the way my mother styled it before formal dinners. But now I could see the effort underneath. The tension around her mouth. The over-controlled posture. Actors know something ordinary people don't. Impersonation is exhausting. When I entered the room, Ethan looked up first. Relief flashed across his face. Then confusion. "Claire," he said quickly, standing halfway. "Thank God, this whole thing's gotten blown out of proportion." I looked at him steadily. 38 years old and still sounding like consequences were temporary misunderstandings. My father didn't stand. "Sit down," he muttered. "Not to me. To Ethan." The lawyers entered moments later along with Daniel Mercer and another woman from legal compliance whose expression remained professionally unreadable. Folders opened. Pens clicked softly. Rain continued whispering against the windows. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the compliance officer folded her hands calmly. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "before any authorization proceeds, we require additional identity verification." My father's jaw tightened instantly. "This is ridiculous." "Routine," she replied. Routine. Interesting word. Everyone in that room understood nothing about this was routine anymore. Deborah smiled faintly and adjusted her scarf with practiced elegance. "I'm happy to answer anything," she said softly. And for one terrifying second she sounded almost exactly like my mother. The officer nodded politely. "Wonderful, let's begin simply." She opened the file. "Mrs. Donovan, can you confirm which side of the bed your husband sleeps on?" Deborah blinked once, then smiled again. "The left." Silence. I watched my father stare down at the table. Because everyone in the room except Deborah knew the truth immediately. My father always slept on the right due to an old shoulder injury from his police years. The officer made a small note. No reaction. Just ink moving quietly across paper. "Next question," she continued gently. "What was the name of your daughter's first military posting?" Deborah hesitated longer this time. "Virginia." Not wrong enough. But not right either. I finally spoke. "Fort Benning," I said calmly. "Georgia." Deborah looked toward my father. Tiny movement. But enough. The officer noticed it too. Another note. Another quiet scratch of ink. Across the table, Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Come on," he muttered. "Nobody remembers every little detail." I turned slowly toward him. "Mom does." Silence again. The dangerous kind. The kind where truth begins filling space whether people want it there or not. The officer continued. "Mrs. Donovan, what nickname did you use for your daughter as a child?" Deborah answered too quickly this time. "Claire Bear." I almost smiled. My mother never used cute nicknames. Not once in my life. "Incorrect," I said softly. Deborah's face changed. Just slightly. Enough to reveal fear beneath performance. The officer closed one folder and opened another. "Mrs. Donovan," she said calmly, "we also have concerns regarding forged identification documents and unauthorized trust modifications." My father slammed his hand against the table. "This is harassment." "No," I answered quietly, "it's verification." He turned toward me then with real anger finally breaking through. "You think you're smarter than everybody in this room." The old accusation. The familiar one. Too competent. Too observant. Too difficult to control. I met his stare evenly. "No," I said, "I just stopped pretending not to notice things." Ethan stood suddenly. This wasn't Dad's idea. Every head turned toward him. And there it was. The fracture. My brother's breathing grew uneven. We needed help. The house, the debts. "Ethan," my father warned sharply. But Ethan looked close to breaking now. "You always helped me," he whispered toward our father. "You said it would be temporary." Temporary. That word families use when enabling becomes inheritance. Deborah slowly removed the pearl earrings and placed them carefully on the table. I didn't know all of it, she said quietly. I swear to God I didn't. My father stared at her in disbelief. You're talking too much. No, she answered shakily, you are. The room fell completely silent. Even the rain seemed quieter somehow. Then I reached calmly into my bag and placed the photograph onto the table. Deborah final fitting. My father's handwriting visible across the back. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked directly at my father. For years I imagined revenge would feel explosive if it ever came. Loud, emotional, satisfying. Instead it felt heartbreakingly calm. You didn't trust Mom with the truth, I said softly. You didn't trust Ethan to survive consequences. And you never trusted me unless I stayed useful. His face hardened instantly. You think you're better than this family. The sentence echoed through the room. Old pain disguised as anger. I held his gaze steadily. No, I replied quietly. I just got tired of begging to be chosen. Something inside him collapsed then. Not dramatically. Silently. Like an old building finally surrendering to years of hidden structural damage. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked old to me. Not powerful. Not stubborn. Just tired. After the meeting ended, nobody stood immediately. That's what I remember most. Not shouting. Not threats. Just silence settling over the room like dust after a collapse. The compliance officer gathered documents carefully while Ethan sat staring at his hands as though he no longer recognized them. Deborah wiped quietly at mascara beneath her eyes with the corner of a tissue, her posture finally sagging under the weight of exhaustion. And my father remained completely still. For years, Richard Donovan had filled every room he entered. Even in silence, he carried authority the way some men carry cologne permanently woven into the air around them. But now something had changed. The room no longer bent around him. Truth had taken up more space than he did. I signed several statements for the bank before leaving. Temporary freezes, fraud investigations, protective reviews on the trust. My signature moved steadily across each page while rain continued streaking down the tall conference room windows behind us. No one tried to stop me when I finally stood. Not my father. Not Ethan. Not even Deborah. Because some endings don't require permission. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine gray mist that coated the sidewalks and parked cars in silver. I stood beneath the awning near the entrance for a moment, breathing cold air into lungs that suddenly felt heavier than they had that morning. My phone buzzed. Mom? Her flight had landed early in Dulles because of favorable winds across the Atlantic. I'm home, she said softly. Something in me nearly broke at those words. Home. Such a simple thing until people start trying to steal it from each other. I'll come get you, I said. No, she replied gently. Come to the house instead. The house. Not home. I noticed the difference immediately. The drive to Fairfax took nearly 40 minutes through wet traffic and low clouds. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, evening had already begun settling across the neighborhood. Porch lights glowed softly through the rain, while somewhere nearby wind chimes moved in slow, uneven rhythms. Mom opened the front door before I knocked. For a second we simply stared at each other. Then she stepped forward and touched my face lightly with both hands the way she used to before deployments. You look tired, she whispered. I almost laughed. Instead, I hugged her carefully, and for one brief moment I allowed myself to feel how exhausted I really was. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and old wood polish. Familiar, safe, fragile now in ways it had never been before. My father sat alone in the kitchen. No television. No newspaper. Just one untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him beneath the yellow overhead light. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. My mother walked quietly upstairs without speaking to him. That silence carried more disappointment than screaming ever could. I removed my coat slowly and sat across from him at the table. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly nearby. Rain tapped against the windows over the sink. Somewhere upstairs I heard my mother opening and closing dresser drawers with controlled, deliberate movements. Finally my father cleared his throat. She was never supposed to get hurt, he said. I stared at him quietly. Not because I didn't understand the sentence. Because I understood it perfectly. Men like my father often mistake intention for innocence. As though harm only counts when cruelty was the goal. You forged her identity, I said calmly. I was trying to protect Ethan. There it was again. Always Ethan. My brother's failures had become the emotional center of our family years ago, pulling everyone else into orbit around his instability. Dad rubbed one hand slowly over his mouth. He was drowning. And Mom wasn't. He looked away immediately. That answer told me everything. Families have invisible roles. Mine certainly did. Ethan was the fragile one. Dad was the rescuer. Mom was the peacemaker. And me. I was the one expected to survive quietly. I kept every article about you, he said suddenly. The shift startled me. I frowned slightly. What? In the garage. His voice sounded rougher now. Every promotion, every medal, every newspaper clipping. I thought about the dusty box beneath the old police uniforms. The carefully folded articles hidden like secrets. You never said anything. His jaw tightened. You didn't need encouragement. The sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Because he genuinely believed it. For most of my life, my strength had been treated like proof I required less love. Less protection. Less tenderness. I looked at my father sitting beneath the kitchen light with his tired shoulders and trembling hands, and suddenly I saw the truth clearly for the first time. He had loved me. He just loved me like a man preparing someone for war. And somewhere along the way he forgot daughters also need softness. You know what the worst part is? I asked quietly. He looked up slowly. I would have helped Ethan. His face changed instantly. Pain. Real pain this time. Not anger. Not pride. Just recognition arriving too late. I know, he whispered. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly beneath my mother's footsteps. My father stared down at the cooling coffee between his hands. Then, finally, very quietly, he said the thing I never expected to hear from him. You stopped needing me. The words settled into the kitchen like smoke. And suddenly I understood everything. His fear. His resentment. Even the distance. My father knew how to love people who depended on him. But independence felt like abandonment to men raised in his generation. I leaned back slowly in the chair and studied him for a long moment. For years I thought revenge meant causing equal pain, making someone feel the same loneliness they gave you. But sitting there across from my aging father, while rain whispered against the windows of my childhood home, revenge no longer felt important. Freedom did. The freedom to stop begging for emotional permission. The freedom to occupy space without apologizing for it. The freedom to understand that being overlooked was never proof I lacked value. A few days later, I returned to my townhouse in Alexandria. I hung my uniform jacket carefully in the closet and stood alone in the quiet kitchen, watching evening sunlight fade slowly across the counters. Everything looked the same. But I wasn't. I made coffee and sat by the window listening to distant traffic while the city settled into night. For most of my life, I thought strength meant enduring pain silently. Now I think strength is something else. I think strength is refusing to disappear inside other people's expectations. And maybe that's the real revenge. Not destruction. Not punishment. Just finally becoming visible to yourself. If this story touched something in you, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been the strong one in your family? The one everyone assumed would survive without comfort? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. These stories remind us that quiet pain exists in more homes than people admit. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, subscribe and stay with us. We share new stories every day, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey.